Hi folks, welcome back. It's Roman Harkovsky here with IBM. Today I would like to discuss total cost of acquisition. I get a lot of questions from customers. What's the cost difference between WebLogic, WebSphere, JBoss application server? And most of my customers are initially looking at the cost comparison just based on the license cost. They're really not looking at the total cost of ownership because that's a really complex area. It's very difficult to figure out all of the exact cost differences that go into TCO, being administration, being security, performance, and downtime, and various risks, and violation of service level agreements, and all kinds of things. I usually picture them with an iceberg, where the iceberg is really split into two pieces. The smaller piece, the top of the iceberg, is total cost of acquisition, usually 10% or less of the TCO, and the entire iceberg, including the bottom part of it, which is usually underwater, that's the entire TCO, and that includes all of those things: performance, administration, and so forth. So today, let's look at the easy part. Let's look at the tip of the iceberg, 10%, and let's see how WebSphere, WebLogic, and TCO compare to each other. To make it easier, I've built a TCA spreadsheet. You can download it. You can get it from Microsoft OneDrive. It's just a regular Excel spreadsheet, which I pre-filled with license information. If you use the online version, then you can only see the numbers. It's read-only. But if you want to put your own numbers, number of transactions, or number of sockets, number of servers, or any other configuration that we'll walk through today, then you can use that in the local copy. You just have to download it into your laptop, desktop, and play around with it. With that, let's get started. So let me show you the spreadsheet that I've built. It's a fairly simple spreadsheet. It has 5 tabs, and the first one, where you enter all of the data, is TCA tab, total cost of acquisition. The second tab is used for calculations. There are a number of things, and you don't really need to enter any data in the TCA tab. The third one is IBM tab, and that's where you could see all of the list prices for IBM products. The next one is Oracle. You could see Oracle list prices there. And finally, Red Hat. Again, the second, third, fourth, and fifth tabs, you don't really need to use them. So we'll look at the TCA tab. In the TCA tab, you can compare various scenarios to each other. Let's start with a really basic scenario. Let's imagine something that's usually not the case in the enterprise. You just have one server, one socket, one core. And we'll compare that for 1 year. So what I do in the spreadsheet, I say 1 year, and I'll say I only have one server, which has one socket, which has one core. In IBM case, this will be 50 PVUs. We'll imagine this is x86 platform, so it's 0.5 core factor for Oracle. And if you hover with the mouse over all of these entry fields, you could see the comments that I've put in there, and the comments explain what that is, what's a valid range of values is, and you can use that as a guidance to enter proper data into the spreadsheet. Now, for this simple configuration, let's imagine there is no HTTP server, none of those things. We'll say you only need 2 support contacts for that configuration. There is no peak workload. There is no virtualization. There is no cold backup. And we'll just leave it at that. So this is very unrealistic configuration because very few customers, really, companies run just single core, single app server. But with that, you could see that JBoss is the most expensive of the 3. The reason is JBoss sells their licenses in bundles of 16. And that's why it's not good for JBoss to have this kind of configuration. Now let's do a little bit different thing. Let's say we have 4 physical servers. Each of those servers has 2 sockets, and each socket has, let's take 4 cores, for instance. In this configuration, you could see that IBM is only 1% more expensive than JBoss, and Oracle is actually the least expensive. The interesting part here is that with IBM, you have socket-based and PVU-based pricing for WebSphere base. When you only have 4 sockets, then the tool automatically uses PVU-based pricing. Now if we start using more sockets, for instance a little bit newer hardware with 6 cores, then you could see that IBM is now less expensive than JBoss, but Oracle is less expensive. Again, this is not yet realistic. We'll get to realistic configuration just a little bit later, because for now we're using some very basic assumptions with which usually nobody runs those kinds of configurations. But I just want to walk you through the tool to explain how it works. Now, let's say you have a relatively new server. The latest Intel Haswell processor has 18 cores. So if we were using 18 cores processors, which would be the latest hardware, then you could see, because WebSphere App Server Base and WebLogic Standard, they both can use socket-based licensing. They become a lot less expensive than JBoss. The reason is because JBoss is using core-based pricing, and again it's sold in bundles of cores. So we'll go back to, let's say 12 cores per socket, not quite 18, 12 cores, and we'll say 70 PVU rating for IBM cores. And now let's do this. Let's say we have not just 1 year, but we have 2-year contract, or 3-year, or let's go to realistic 5-year. That's usually the time frame. For 5 years you have WebSphere, JBoss, and WebLogic, and you could see for this configuration for 5 years both WebSphere and WebLogic are cheaper. Now let's get a little bit closer to the realistic configuration. Let's say that you do need HTTP server, because most applications, they don't just have the app server, but you also need to serve HTTP traffic, images, and other things. So I'll change the HTTP server to yes, and what happens with Oracle and JBoss, they become more expensive because they don't provide free HTTP server. You have to buy the Red Hat EWS, JBoss EWS to get Apache HTTP server. And with Oracle you have to buy the web tier. So let me show you quickly. With Oracle there is a web tier which is priced by socket or core, and for Red Hat there is JBoss EWS, which is also sold in bundles of 16 cores. So we need HTTP server. Now, do we need JDK? With Oracle and WebLogic Oracle and WebSphere, you get free JDK, which is supported out of the box. With Red Hat, you only get JDK if you're running on Red Hat Linux. For other platforms, you have to purchase JDK, or you can run on unsupported open source JDK, OpenJDK, for instance. Now, the thing is, at the end of March 2015, Oracle discontinued publishing security fixes for the JDK 7, so you can no longer use JDK 7 for production free of charge. So you have a couple of choices. One is you could use JDK 8, which means you will have to migrate your applications to JDK 8, or second option you could purchase JDK support, or maybe again move into Red Hat Linux where you'll get OpenJDK support from Red Hat. Now, if I say that I do need JDK support with JBoss and I purchase that from Oracle, for instance JDK 7 support from Oracle, you could see how much more expensive JBoss becomes, because JDK support from Oracle is very, very expensive, because you have to buy the license and then you have to buy the JDK. So let's imagine for this scenario that you're running on Red Hat Linux and you get OpenJDK, or you're using JDK 8 and you're not gonna pay for support. So I'll turn that to no. Next thing, if you're using JBoss and you need to manage that environment and monitor, then you probably will be using JBoss Operations Network. JBoss Operations Network uses database for persistence, and you don't get the database with JBoss EAP. So if you have to buy the database, I'll say yes, you buy subscription to PostgreSQL. For HTTP sessions, you have two choices for failover, if you do need the failover though. If you don't need the failover, don't worry about it, just say no. If you do need the failover, you can have in-memory replication for HTTP sessions for WebSphere, JBoss, and WebLogic, or you can have database-based persistence and failover for HTTP sessions. And for database persistence, with WebSphere we provide HTTP persistence in DB2, or we support other databases, but the difference with WebSphere, we give free DB2 license. With JBoss or WebLogic, you have to purchase the database. So if you are using database for persistence, which I'll say yes, that adds cost to Oracle and JBoss. Now LDAP, with WebSphere, we bundle LDAP free of charge. You can use that. If you have Active Directory, you could say no, or if you have other LDAP solution, you can say no. But if you do need supported LDAP and you don't already have one, with JBoss and Oracle, you have to buy one. So I'll say yes, and again, the price for Oracle and Red Hat increases. I do have a couple of options here. If you already have WebSphere licenses, you could say, I already have 1000 WebSphere PVUs and, for instance, 20 sockets. So that would make WebSphere cost 0 because you already have that. So I'll zero it out. Usually, if you have a significant environment, you cannot limit yourself to only 1 or 2 people for support. With JBoss, the trouble is, for 16 and 32 cores, you only have 2 support people to call for support. If they're sick or if they're on vacation at the same time, they might be in trouble. So I would usually say for this configuration, you need 6 people who need to be able to call for support. For 64 cores and higher, the more JBoss bundles and cores you buy, the more support contacts you get, up to 12 support contacts free of charge with 196 cores of JBoss. You could enter vendor discounts. For instance, you could say 20% discount off the list price or 30% for all 3 vendors. I'm not gonna bother. The other thing that's really interesting is virtualization. I rarely see any customers not using virtualization. Very few companies run app servers or other workloads on bare metal. Fewer and fewer, as a matter of fact. So what I have in this tool in here, and you could see it on the right hand side, it's called server allocation. What that means is, let's say you have an environment where you have 24 cores in a server. A lot of times you would only use part of that environment to run application server. For instance, you have say 12 cores or 10 cores. Let's say 12 cores out of 24 you run application server, and the other 12 cores is not used at all or runs whatever other workload, maybe database or maybe something else. So if it's 12 cores out of 24 running app server, then I put 50% server allocation. Well, that means only half of the server is being used for the app server. If you have, for instance, 10 cores, and from 10 cores, 8 of those 10 are used for app server, I'd say 80%. If you use 2 cores out of 10, I would say 20%. So you get the idea. You can hover the mouse and you could see the suggestion and comments. And the trouble is, for Oracle WebLogic, they don't recognize virtualization in a software capability. VMware, KVM, and other hypervisors, in most cases, other than Oracle VM and Microsoft Hyper-V, they do not recognize software-based virtualization. They do recognize Power 7, LPARs, and some limited configurations, as well as some micro-partitions, not in all configurations though. But in a typical case of x86 virtualization with KVM or VMware, Oracle requires customers to pay for the entire server, not just for the cores that are being used. This reminds me of an interesting cartoon that I found on the web about this, where somebody parked in the parking lot said, "What? You charged me $1 million to park, and the parking lot is empty?" And they say, "Yeah, we had to charge you for every spot because you could have parked everywhere." So that's pretty much the Oracle licensing policy for virtualization. So let's get back to the spreadsheet. So let's imagine you have perhaps 70% virtualization rate. So that means 7 cores out of 10 in a server run application server workload. The next thing is warm backup and cold backup. With JBoss and WebSphere, we do recognize warm backup as a free, meaning it's up and running, installed, but you don't handle real live transactions. With JBoss and WebSphere, that's free. With Oracle, you would have to pay. And if I enter 100% for the warm backup, meaning the size of my warm backup is the same as my hot cluster size, and I hit enter, you could see Oracle cost simply doubles because you have to license that warm backup. So let's put it to 0. Cold backup. Cold backup is environment where you have the application installed but not running. The reason you have cold backup is for failover purposes, and you would normally run dry runs to test that it works, and usually you want to run it either once a week or maybe once a month, meaning if it's once a month, 12 times a year. In Oracle case, if you use it more than 10 times in a calendar year, then you have to pay for the cold backup. And the cold backup, if it was a full size of the hot cluster, 100%, again, it doubles Oracle cost. Last couple of items I have here are performance advantages of WebSphere. So for instance, if you look at the WebSphere performance, and I have it posted on my blog, Jason Gartner from IBM, he recently published a blog article explaining that in a SpecJ app server 2010, IBM ran 31% faster per core. So if I scroll down and I show you this graph, normalized by the core, WebSphere app server ran exactly the same application as WebLogic, 31% faster, more transactions for the same core on identical hardware. And the results were published only 1 day apart, back in February, so it was only about a month ago. And that's why I have 31% difference. With WebLogic, there are SpecJ results. With JBoss, there are none. Red Hat has never published a single result comparing WebSphere, comparing JBoss performance to other vendors. And that's why we have run the benchmark DayTrader application, which is open source Geronimo, part of Geronimo Apache project. We ran it on JBoss. Depending on configuration, we've seen up to 80% and then sometimes even higher performance difference between WebSphere and JBoss. So that's quite significant. Now, 80% may not be representative of your specific application, so let's make it very, very conservative, and let's just use the same numbers for WebLogic. Let's just say 31%, although I really doubt that JBoss can run quite as fast as WebLogic. So let's just keep 31% for both. Now again, if I max out on all of the configurations, 100% warm backup, and 100% cold backup, you could see that Oracle is way, way more expensive. So I can remove the warm backup and I'll keep the cold backup, and I will keep the performance difference and the server virtualization as well. One last item I want to cover here is the peak workload. So there is really interesting dynamic here. Obviously, a lot of projects run through the year, but they don't necessarily have even distribution of the workload through the year. So on the right hand side, you could see I'm showing the performance workload of the application distributed through the year. Different applications could have different peaks. Certain projects have peaks in December, November, especially retail industry, Black Friday, and those kinds of things. And with WebSphere and all of the IBM software, just recently, about a month ago, we announced monthly pricing. And what that means, you can buy WebSphere or DB2 or many other IBM software products on a rental basis just for 1 month. So for example, if I say that I do have 1 month of peak workload, and the peak workload is 1.8 times bigger than my normal workload, then what you can see, the difference between WebSphere and JBoss and WebLogic becomes so much bigger, because in this case, in November, I would only buy 1 license or whatever number of licenses of WebSphere just for that 1 month. For JBoss and WebLogic, I would have to buy for the peak, even though I'm not using those licenses. So the interesting part is, with IBM, we have perpetual licenses, and perpetual licenses we have based on number of cores in the server. For WebSphere base, we have licenses based on number of sockets, and for Express and Liberty Core, you can even buy user-based licenses. And of course, we have unlimited license for WebSphere, but that's subject to negotiation. Now, we also have pay-as-you-go licenses, so that means a rental license, and it's a bundle of license and support in one product, and you can use it as long as you have current subscription. So it's somewhat like JBoss subscription. So we have 1 year subscription, and this is, by the way, true for most of the IBM products. You can buy 1 year subscription, and that's very similar to JBoss subscription. In this case, IBM bundles license and support together. We have Socket 1 year subscription for WebSphere base, 1 month subscription for Socket. We have 1 month subscription for PVU or core based licenses. If you're running on Power, you can even buy WebSphere or other IBM products just for 1 day. And that's very handy for workloads. I'm not using it in the spreadsheet, so this is here just for your information. But if you do have just 1 or 2 days or 3 days of workload on Power, you can buy both hardware, memory and CPU, and licenses of software just for 1 day. That would make it even more advantageous to run WebSphere or IBM software on there. And you can also buy it by the hour on Amazon, on Azure, on SoftLayer, and other clouds in the future. You can buy WebSphere and other IBM products by the hour, so usage-based pricing. So again, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, or perpetual license. With that, I will finish. I will be happy to answer any questions. Post your comments on the blog or on a YouTube video, and I'll be happy to answer and explain. And the link to the latest version of this document is in the left-hand side of the spreadsheet, so you can click and download a local copy so you can play with these numbers. Thank you.